everybody, welcome very much to the first evening of National Hedgerow Week. It's our second National Hedgerow Week 2022. So thank you so much for joining us on this evening for our Hedgerow Happy Hour and our Hedge Talk. We've got a great topic this evening, which is hedge makers planting and nurturing the healthy hedgerows of the future. So it's a really, really important topic. My name is Louise Bow and I manage our Hedgerows programme at the Tree Council. And joining us for the talk this evening, I've got two of my colleagues. We've got Ian Turner, who is our head of major planting and ecology projects in the southern region, and Jackie Shallcross, who's our shared outcomes project lead. Ian has always had a passion for trees and nature, and he's been working in arboriculture for many years now, planting and managing trees and hedgerows, so he does know what he's talking about. And Jackie has got a background in plant sciences and has worked on projects communicating best practice research about planting trees and hedgerows. So she's also got lots of really useful stuff to contribute this evening. The setup this evening is our speakers will do both of their talks. If you have any questions, if you could please put them in the Q&A section, and then we will answer those at the end, and we'll try and get in as many questions as we can with the time we've got available. And yeah, we'll do that at the end. So just if there's any short questions, we may answer them as we go along, but most of those we'll probably cover at the end. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Ian to kick us off. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks very much, Louise, and welcome everybody to this first Hedge Talk. I'll share my screen and we'll have a look at what we need to be doing to be looking after trees and planting them. So, as Louise said, this is about planting and nurturing hedges in their early years and choices about which trees we might want to put in and what sort of hedges are good and what maybe aren't so good. So running through the what we're going to cover tonight is what is actually a hedge and why should we be planting hedges, and then where to plant them and what are the right shrubs and trees that we should be putting within those hedges. And then we will be looking really at what will be happening in terms of the trees that we have within those hedges. And then Jackie at the end will be covering how we're going to be protecting those trees. So the most important thing is, what is a hedge? It's a fairly fundamental question, I know, but something that we have an impression in our mind about what a hedge should look like. And, through this particular, the way that we look at a hedge, it might colour what our expectations are. So first of all, our hedge that we would love to see in our own gardens, I'm sure, would be one that's full of wildlife and has lots of different species and is providing lots and lots of beauty within the countryside and actually all of the benefits that you would expect. But many of us probably expect to see something more like this, which is a conifer hedge, which is primarily one species, which is not so great. And again, maybe a laurel hedge like this one, and which is beautiful and practical and functional, but maybe not so much for wildlife. But it's good for screening, and it's good for us possibly in the urban environment and in other locations where we need something quite dense and steady and even. So why are we planting these hedges? Because essentially the hedge itself isn't just a screen, is it? It's many other things. And at top of the list is wildlife. I mean, why wouldn't you want to have wildlife? You got the birds and also the insects and all of these other animals which can actually use the underside of the hedge or through on actually all the fruit as well on the hedge. And we will get something much more from our hedges if we can see wildlife. But again, one of our priorities at the moment anyway is carbon capture. So what's one of the main benefits? Growing hedge will always lock up way more carbon than, because it can cover a huge area and it's providing many other services. It is something that we need to consider as part of the mix. So along with pollution control, and another one, unexpected one, is wood fuel, because when we look at the more mature hedges which haven't been cut, we actually have got lots of wood within those hedges, and it is something that can, be overlooked. So shelter and shade and screening, privacy, we all know. Noise reduction, we've all used hedges for these, but fruit and nuts, particularly edible hedges, are something that we want to see more of in the countryside and in people's houses and in gardens. But another one that's unseen is soil loss. That actually we can prevent soil loss by having hedges which can actually intercept the rainfall and also prevent the rainfall from actually washing away the soil. But other sort of more hidden and probably more nuanced kind of benefits is that flooding benefit, to reduce the likelihood of flooding by holding water and keeping those pollutants from watercourses and improving that air quality to the point where we're locking up, particulates and preventing the damage that can do to, particularly to vulnerable young adults and children. So the actual hedge itself is that barrier between us and some of the less desirable parts of the modern world. And one of the last ones, which is, I think, the one we all know, which is livestock control, just stopping animals getting out and wandering out from fields. And this is one of the things that I'm particularly passionate about, which is connectivity. You can see from this photo that actually we have a lovely field with some trees and a little remnant of hedgerow. However, this is the state of many of our hedges, which is it's not quite complete. And we need to see better hedges in our countryside and better connectivity between, as you can see, that woodland off in the distance. Between woodlands like that, we need to improve that connectivity. So that's something that we need to look at, is improving that. And that's another reason for planting our hedgerows. But where do we plant them? So as I've said, we do need to reconnect some of these habitats. And as you can see from that roadside, there is, a small hedge there. I mean, obviously a better hedge is a taller hedge, but we can still see there is a connectivity there, and you can see that there is, that sense that it's going from one location to another, connecting up to different habitats. Another reason to put these hedges in this location is because we are obviously intercepting that the air that comes from the roadside and the pollution that might come through from the vehicles running along that lane. And the contours of slopes, that's where we really need to look at planting, because if we plant along the edges of those contours, then what we're looking at doing is preventing the water running off into our watercourses. And that will intercept all of that moisture and prevent us from getting flooding, or reduce that impact from the water that's going to be coming. More than anything now is that climate change is causing there to be heavier rainfall events. So we need to be looking at ways we can reduce and slow that flow. But we all know that we've seen, our parks and in the edges of our own gardens, we've got hedges, but many gardens don't have hedges, they have fences. And what is better than a fence, to have something that's living, to have a living barrier which maintains itself effectively. We have to replace fences, whereas with hedges, we don't need to maintain them, but that living barrier will provide so much more. So why don't we plant? Well, there are some important habitats out there which we want to protect, and we want to make sure that we retain the wildlife benefits of existing habitats. So particularly calcareous grassland, or in this case, and the second point is, deep organic soils, which is peats. And that where we've got large open spaces where there may be some, again, grassland or maybe wet areas that actually may not be as suitable for hedges anyway, but we need to be aware of what's in that location. And we don't want to be just putting hedges anywhere. We need to be very select about the actual risk that we might be creating from it. So in this case, from providing areas which can harbour antisocial behaviour. But how much space do I need to actually create that hedge space, or to do we need a lot of space? Well, we don't need a lot of space, but it was actually really desirable to have a big wide area to put the hedge, like this picture here. You've got a nice wide strip. Now, the reason why that wide strip is useful is because we are providing way more habitat when that hedge establishes. And the reason why this hedge, even though it looks small at the moment, it will fill that entire space, and that will create a huge volume both in terms of forage and also somewhere for rest and shelter, which is ideal habitat for birds, reptiles, and for invertebrates, which we need within our landscape, but we also need for sustainable farming. So the actual space here, we've been very specific about the amount of space, but flexibility and pragmatism, we need to create space for these hedges and for these strips and for these margins. But when we come down to our own spaces in the garden, we only need it's as little as 50 centimeters width to actually provide enough space for a small hedge. But the most important thing of all, again, is that wildlife. Always remember to provide wildlife margins. So what are the right choices? Well, what's it for? What is this hedge for that we're creating? And the reasons for putting that hedge in will dictate what we do next. But to actually select the right trees, we need to know what the soil is. We need to look at other hedges in the area to make sure of our species. And we need to make sure that we're not making a huge management mistake and actually increasing how much more inputs we need into that hedge. And on the principles of how we select, one of the top priorities for us really should be that we use native species. However, they're not always the most suitable. We do need to make sure that we do provide the services that native trees provide naturally, but we also need to look at potentially resilience as well. So we need to make sure that there's a huge number of those different species. So just in case we have problems in the future with climate change and disease. And we need to also look at the trees that are above those hedges, because that's just another layer, another level of habitat, and it also provides an extra point on which we can get other birds and other species that are dependent upon us providing this longer term and much more consistent management of trees. We need more trees and more hedges at the same time. But more than anything, again, think about the fact that we've got local stock already. We've also got local provenance, which is a type of, the source of genetic material that we need to be looking at. We need to be looking at those trees that are actually already in that environment, that are within the hedges already. So we need to watch out for, and this is the things that we shouldn't do. We're trying to avoid making mistakes when we're putting our hedge in. And the first of that is planting the wrong species that might spread too much. Now, a blackthorn hedge in an agricultural environment is perfect, but it might not be good for a garden, say. And again, a hawthorn species just with one species alone is not as valuable as having many species. So that 5+ species is really, really important to have to make sure that we provide the maximum benefits. And one of the last things to worry about, and I think, we all know about yew as being poisonous, but we've got to consider there may be other species which we want to put in the hedge, which may provide a problem to us in the long run. I mean, obviously acorns can be poisonous, but it's just something to consider. But when you're thinking about species of animal that might be using that field underneath that hedge. And the other part of this is, if you're going to put a blackthorn into an environment where people are, you've got to be really careful that they're aware, or you're aware that if there's going to be people walking by this hedge, that if they were to get scratched by it, say if it was a blackthorn that they got scratched by, that there may be also a likelihood of infection, and particularly blackthorn is poor for that. But for the most part, we don't have to worry about these things, but there are a few species we need to be aware of. So what do we want in this mix? There are many choices that we can, many of different species which are suitable. This is our wildlife mix. I mean, there's more than one mix, and it dependent very much on what the location you're planting into. You know, both it's a cultural environment as well as being one which is all about the species that you're needing or want to have in that hedge. So out of all of these, just making sure that you get enough of these particular species in your hedge, and you will get a richer environment for your for the bees in this case, but also for birds. But we need to make sure that the diversity is there. And this is a kind of another sideline. This is for people, really. The edible hedge. This is to try and get more sort of forage potential for people. Now, in the center of this particular set of photographs is a very orange looking berry, which is actually sea buckthorn, which, along with the apples and the hazel there and the elder, is really excellent for source for human beings, you know, just as a sort of source really for making more food and making us have more contact with nature, and making sure that we actually do get that sort of, you know, that sense that we're in nature and we're getting something from nature. So you consider this mix as part of, you know, the many kind of different mixes you could have. I mean, every single place is different. So using those criteria that I've given you before, you will be able to select a good hedge to have in your backyard or in your park or wherever you're planting. So one of the most important things in urban scenarios is how do we manage air quality? And there are, you know, native hedges that could be suitable for this location. However, because it's an urban environment, usually that we're planting into, evergreens are suitable. And these natives that we put at the top there, the yew, the box, the juniper, are very, very good. But we're now aware that actually non-natives like cotoneaster are superb for actually reducing the amount of pollutants, and that's, you know, that are actually in the air because of the hairs on the back of their leaves. They actually lock them down, and then we get that locked up. Instead of it being in the air, it's in the ground, or, you know, it's something that we then don't breathe in. And consider the other kind of trees that could be within those hedges as well. So species such as whitebeam and the elm as well, because of that superb ability to actually lock up those what would already be sort of carcinogenic particulates. We can get those out of the air by planting, rather than, you know, just by reducing the amount of you know, cars there. We can actually do this using nature. So the cotoneaster itself also is a source of berries for birds too, but it has a downside. And that is that it can be an invasive. So we have to be aware of what we're planting could also have that downside. So where do we get all of these trees? Well, I've put a list which isn't definitive. I mean, and it's not in any particular order, but getting your trees from a tree nursery will always be a reliable source. And it just allows you to a sense that the quality and the care that's gone into that particular tree is sufficient to make sure that it's more likely to survive that transplant into your garden or into that location where you're planting it. Community tree nurseries are growing in number, and it is something that we would really encourage is communities to set up their own tree nursery, so they can actually get their own trees, and they can see the benefit both for people and make that connection to the tree species, but also to take the seed from the local trees and turn that into, you know, a resource which then they can plant out in their community, knowing that it's something from their community and it's from that location and suitable for that location. Growing your own is such a pleasurable experience. I can highly recommend going out and getting those seeds. You know, we do that in our own community, where you can actually go with others to find the right seeds and the seeds that you know will be successful. There is further guidance on that Jackie will be pointing out later on, which is the Tree Growers Guide. And lastly, the garden centre, that's still an option for most people, is to go to a garden centre and purchase the trees when, you know, because they'll be there. The garden centres don't tend to be very seasonal. They tend to be a time you can buy at any time of the year. However, you have to be wary about what you're buying and the condition of it, and ensure that it's been looked after, and ensure that you plant it at the right time too. But everything falls down to kind of that now, what the hedge species and what the size is that you're going to plant. So with traditional planting, and certainly in the last 20-30 years, we've been planting what is called a whip, which is a small bare root tree. It's a very small one. It's 40 to 60 centimeters tall, and it's called a whip because it is purely that. It's no soil on it, and it's just all of it is the actual plant. And this is a really a size which is perfect for survival in when it's been planted, because actually when they get to this size, they're transportable, and they can be planted relatively easily, and can be bundled up, as per this picture here, in 20 or 30 plants bundles. And then cell grown is another option, which is very easy to transport and plant, but is much smaller, and it just needs to be treated with some care. So we need to be careful about when we're buying our trees to make sure we get the right size, but also to get something that's suitable for the people who are planting those trees. So when to plant? Well, that's changing. That's a bit of a moving target at the moment because of climate change. We're obviously getting quite a bit of warming going on, round about February time. But traditionally, we probably would have planted even into March, but now it's getting so warm. We're getting very warm days, and that's breaking dormancy for some trees, which means that the later you plant, the more likely you're going to get problems with survival. So at the moment, if we look at planting from the end of November to Christmas and a bit after Christmas, and at the latest the end of February, then you're going to get the best results, and the tree is going to be dormant, and it's going to have some resource left inside it. It won't have exhausted itself. So with that, if you are going to get these trees, and if you're going to get a whip, then if you are going to buy them, you need to actually get them in the ground pretty quickly, because if you don't get them in the ground, they can dry out, or they can exhaust themselves because they don't have the water. And so that is where the concept of healing in comes from. You put those trees in some wet sand or in some soil, some loose soil, so that you can actually keep it alive until you're ready to plant it. But timing is important. And with that, before you get those trees, even think about how are you going to prepare that ground? How are you going to make sure that those trees have the best conditions to be planted into? Now, I think we all know that if you're going to plant, you're going to try and dig up the soil and make sure that the plant can actually get at some loose soil. So rotivating and ploughing would seem very logical, but it does have some downsides, and that can cause more plants to grow in the following year that you don't want. So that's competition for the tree. There is an alternative, and there's two there, one is turf cutting, which is when you cut off the turf, you're able to sort of just use a spade or sometimes a machine to actually take off the top level, that bit of competition, that bit of grass that maybe you're trying to plant into. Getting rid of that just means that you don't have as much removed from the soil, so that the actual tree itself can establish much more readily. Or digging a trench, which obviously removes anything that's covering that soil. And also, because it's a hedge, it's a nice line, so it's logical to just make a trench so that you can just infill with your soil and with your trees. So with the line that you're going to create, and you can see this is a beautiful line in this photo of trees, this is where you normally do have 2 rows, but you can have 3 rows of hedge. And it's around about 4 to 5 per meter, 4 to 5 trees per meter, and in a staggered row. But it's down to you. If you've got more space, you can plant more and you can go wider. But obviously, for the most part, most people will be restricted into a much tighter row and probably less staggered. But if you do go for that single row, just be careful of that spacing. And with the actual way that we plant the trees, obviously it is that 4 plants, 5 plants per meter. And looking at that spacing of about 25 centimeters, you actually will need to try and measure that out fairly accurately. If you're going to be doing it at field scale, you probably have to be a little less worried about that. But I think from more than anything, looking at that method of planting, so notch planting, which is a bit of a sort of a terminology we use, which is where you put a spade in the ground, you wiggle it around, and then you put your plant in that. So pretty much like this, you create a notch, so a slit in the ground, and then, as has been done in this picture, you can see that the person planting has just pushed the roots in and gently sort of push the roots in so that you then can push the soil back to squeeze either side to make sure that the soil's in there and pushed up against the roots. And then this other plant here with much bigger roots, which you sometimes get, it has to have a much bigger hole because of just the distribution of the roots. So this is a key to getting survival rates much higher. So getting many more trees to survive is mulching, because when you think about the whole life cycle of the soil, it requires lots of nutrient and it also requires carbon. And so mulching, not only does it provide a protection for the soil and reducing the competition, so stopping other things growing, but also it allows the recycling of the carbon from within that mulch. And it does help you to avoid using plastic and matting and geotextiles. And something like that's more of a tree chip is much better than, so wood chip is much better than using compost. And primarily because wood chip contains it's much more solid. It actually has much more substance to it, and it takes much longer to break down, and it breaks down into the soil and creates a much better soil, and it actually recycles much better into the soil, and it will be much more present after a year, whereas something, if you put a compost down, then it will disappear very quickly. We've mentioned herbicides here. Obviously, using herbicides, it is a threat to the balance within the soil. You will affect the soil if you spray with herbicide. So our advice is not to use any herbicides whatsoever, because there could be a longer legacy. It could be a much worse sort of condition. The soil could be much worse if you spray it with herbicide. We've seen obviously recently some proof that these herbicides do remain in the environment much longer than actually their manufacturers would care to admit, so we prefer not to spray. And using fresh wood chip, because it's just as good as using the well-rotted, although it will take longer to break down, but that's a benefit because it's reducing the available nutrients for the competition in the surface of the soil, whereas the tree is planted much lower down and will gain from that chip as it rots. So this is a bit of a hot topic at the moment. Watering is something that we're fully aware that is required of certain projects and certain trees. However, if you can get the establishment right, if you can plant your tree well and you can mulch it well, you won't need to do that watering as much as you think. And there is plenty of evidence to suggest that it's the timing of your planting, it's the mulching that you do, and it's the species that you choose for that space and that soil type that will help you avoid having to do that. However, putting plans in place, it's not a problem to plan for that requirement, for watering, and to put that into any of your plans in terms of the costing of when you're planting. And so, looking at how it was this summer, this hedge was well mulched and it wasn't watered. Yes, it remained green and it remained healthy. So there is evidence there that actually having the conditions right is more important than the water. But please, please, please do make some plans for watering, because drought events are getting more severe and longer and more unpredictable. So make a plan. So there are two golden rules, two of probably many, but if you're going to take away two when you're planting, these are the two that are very, very important when you're thinking about the plant's health themselves. So don't ever let those roots get frosted or dry, because the plant will die. And if it doesn't die immediately, because it won't be obvious, you will just see that there'll be more dead plants when you come to spring. And then don't plant too deep, because a plant needs to be able to get air. You know, its roots need to have access to air. But if you plant it too deep, it can't establish a good root system, but also it'll be beyond the penetration of air, and it won't be able to use the oxygen it needs, and it won't be able to get rid of the carbon dioxide that it needs to get rid of. So bear in mind those two things when you're planting your hedge. So we've covered all of the other aspects of kind of where you should do it, you know, why you do it, and also, you know, how we can plant that hedge. But now Jackie's going to cover a bit of how to protect that hedge and to ensure that you don't lose your trees after you've planted them.
Thanks, Ian. Good evening, everybody. So you planted it, you've got it in the ground, you've put in all that hard work, describing where you wanted it, what you wanted it for. So you'd really like it to not die. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to plan for that. And that's just me. Next slide, please, Ian. Thank you. So this is what I'm talking about. The picture on the left is just a selection that you can find of kind of things that people call shelters, guards, spirals, bowl guards. There's a whole terminology around it, and I just want to try and demystify some of this. Hopefully I'm going to answer these questions during my little speech here. So when should I use a fence? Do I always need to use a shelter or a guard? What even are shelters and guards? What kind should I use? And importantly, what should I do with it afterwards? So the one on the left here is probably best described as a shelter, but it might have some ventilation holes. Then moving left to right, we've got something that's probably more likely to be described as a guard. It's usually quite sturdy, probably made of plastic. Then we've got the next one along, the brown one in the middle, is probably best described as a kind of wrap. That's probably not to scale, that picture. It's probably much smaller than that in reality. And then we've got a sort of papery, cardboardy sort of a guard. And then we've got the one on the right, which is described as a spiral. I think that one's made of plastic, but there's a whole variety of them that you can get hold of. And there are other kinds even than this. There are loads of them. Next slide, please. So what do you need to know to help you decide if you need to use guards, shelters, spirals, rolls, all the rest of them? What do you need to know to help you decide? So importantly, as Ian said, you need to know why you are planting. At one end of the scale, you might be planting a nice hedge that you want pristine, beautiful, neat, perfect. You might only have a certain budget. It might be really, really important to you that every single one of those trees survives and there's no margin for error. You might have to keep a really, really close eye on the survival rates, and you might have to replace any that die. And so you might have a really low tolerance for any failures. But at the other end of the scale, you might be planting to improve biodiversity. I would hope that you would be. To encourage lots of wildlife. And so you might not really mind in the grand scheme of things if a few of your plants do get nibbled a bit. In fact, even that might be good for a hedge. It might get more bushy if the top bits get nibbled off. But the reality is you'll probably be somewhere in between those two extremes, and it is really up to you to decide what your tolerance is, if you like. You'll need to know what you're planting, as Ian's described. So some species are fine if they get nibbled a bit. And some species, as Ian has also described, do have their own built-in protection, you know, spikes, thorns, poisonous berries, that kind of thing. What are we protecting our trees from with this kind of protection? So we've got accidental damage, which when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about maybe it being damaged by things that we do with machinery. So maybe we're trimming quite close by, or we're mowing the lawn quite close by, when we just might accidentally, you know, a tiny little baby tree might get easily just garroted by a strimmer accidentally. So they do protect against that to some extent. They probably provide a little bit of protection for some weather conditions. It's probably a bit warmer inside one of these things, so it might help protect against frost a little bit, or maybe some very, very exposed sites. But primarily we are protecting against browsing animals, so that's big animals like deer and cattle, medium-sized animals like rabbits and hares, and little ones like mice and voles and things. Deer, it's probably, they tend to eat quite high up. They're big animals, you know, so a shelter that would protect from a deer would be quite a tall shelter. But actually fencing is really good at protecting against deer from coming into the site at all. But fencing can be really quite expensive, and of course not everywhere in the country has deer, so you may not need that. Rabbits and hares tend to eat lower down, right down to the ground, and so in that case it tends to be things like the spirally ones that are a bit of a barrier against that sort of thing. Again, you can have rabbit fencing as well, if you want to, or if you think it's appropriate for your site. And voles and little small rodents can burrow, and they can even eat roots sometimes. Those very short, the brown one that I showed you on the previous slide, those very short vole guards can help a little bit. But there's a big but coming, so if you could have the next slide, please, Ian. They do actually quite like to live in them. Not necessarily the very close-fitting vole guard, but some tree shelters particularly can be a very cozy place for a vole, and they can just nibble off a branch quite happily, or gnaw off the bark, as you can see on the right hand side there, and it's nice, quite a nice cozy place for them to be. But that's probably only for the kind of bigger shelters where you can get it, where they can actually get inside. Thanks, Ian. Have the next slide, please. So I've explained that they can actually, using a shelter or a guard can increase tree survival rates, but only really when there's an actual risk of them being killed or damaged irreparably. It's basically an individual physical barrier against browsing and bark stripping by animals, kind of like a personalized fence for each of the little trees. It's a microclimate to some extent, and the reason that I say that is, I'm just going to mention this briefly, but some of the solid-sided ones, which tend to be known as shelters rather than guards, can be warmer and have less airflow and less light. So there is a bit of a mini microclimate in there. It is worth saying that this can be good, but it can be bad, because it can get really hot inside there. And as Ian was saying, in these drought condition times, it can be really difficult. Little plasticky, tubey things can be cheaper than fencing off a whole area. And actually, sometimes, depending on where you are, fencing off a whole area might not even be an option. You know, there might be access rights away, that kind of thing. So there are actually quite a few reasons for using them, and why people do use them, and why you do see them in the countryside or alongside motorways or on roundabouts. I've seen them. You do see them a lot, and there are reasons why people use them. But there are downsides. Have the next slide, please. The main one is the cost, and I mean all kinds of costs, really. There is an environmental cost in the production of the plastic ones. And obviously there's a carbon cost involved in manufacture and transport of these kinds of products. And there's obviously plastic pollution. We're all very aware of this. There's a couple of pictures there that just near where I live, you just find these things lying around that people haven't collected, and they just kind of stay there, and it's not very good at all. So yeah, the pollution stuff I'll talk about a bit more in a little bit, but needless to say, plastics in the open environment. Not a great idea. Now, having said that, they can be cheaper than fencing. They do cost money. They can be expensive. They usually, sometimes you need extra bits that go with the device. You need a stake maybe and a tie to tie them on sometimes. So that is a cost, can be. You have to put them in. The installation is a thing. You have to do that, and you do have to inspect them regularly to check that they're not damaging your baby trees. And you might have to replace some if they need replacing. Disposal of them is the big one, which I'll talk a bit more about in a little bit. But practically speaking, the spirals can be fiddly to take off, especially if you've got a nice hedge type of tree. Any tree really can be a hedge, but you just put it'll grow through the spirally bits and get more hedgy and bushy, which is what you want in a hedge if you're making it a nice barrier hedge. And you can imagine trying to peel one of those off a spiny, fiddly thing can be quite tricky and fiddly, and they can break in your hand and that kind of thing. And they can be difficult to recycle, which I'll come on to in a little bit. There's a chance that they can damage trees sometimes, maybe the environment inside is a bit too moist, you can invite infection sites, that kind of thing. And how they look. Some people really don't like them. Some people think they are a sign of a good planting project. So, I mean, it's very much what you think and also what the people around you will think. So I'll have the next slide, please. Here's just a couple of examples of some of the downsides. So as you can see, that's a kind of a fence top left, we've got a fence and spiral combo, but the spirals are sort of disintegrating in situ. The picture on the right there is quite a pretty hedge, quite nice and green, growing quite well, but probably isn't a very effective barrier at the bottom there. Anyone, little creatures or whoever could crawl under that. And the one on the bottom left is a picture near where I live of a woodland creation project, which, as you can see, is a sea of plastic tubes, but at least they're doing some planting. Next slide, please, Ian. Oh yes, and this is another tree tube graveyard. Thanks very much, Ian. I'll have the next one. So what to choose? Once you've considered the pros and cons I've just been through, and you've decided that you do need to use something like a guard or a shelter, which ones do you choose? There are loads on the market, so I'm not going to describe each one, but I'd like to help you navigate what is out there. The photo on the left is an example. This is a woodland trial site that you may have seen in the press. Some of those are actually prototype samples, so you probably can't get hold of a couple of those, but it's just to illustrate that there's a range of things that you can get. It's useful to know what some of the terminology is, and I'm going to explain these terms really, really simply. It's just helpful to know. So degradable just means it just will break down. Sometimes the words that people use to describe that is photodegrade, and that just means it will break down in light. And a lot of plastics and things will do that anyway outside in the open environment. Lots of things will. So that's one of the reasons why it's important to remove them before that does happen and reuse them or recycle them. Biodegradable just means a biological process is involved in that degradation. Lots of things will eventually biodegrade, but it's a question of how fast that will happen. You might see descriptions about how fast that will happen on some of the products. To confuse us further, however, plastic can be a blend of materials. And so some of the claims of biodegradability can be quite hard to decipher. Some of the constituent parts might be biodegradable. And so some of the words might be things like inherently biodegradable or readily biodegradable. Doesn't necessarily mean that they will harmlessly melt away into the soil. That's just to be aware of. And then compostable. I think we all think we know what that means, but actually it means something biodegrading in a defined amount of time to a defined extent. And I think they actually measure it by putting biodegradable things through a sieve of a certain size. So something can be biodegradable, but if it doesn't compost within a certain time frame, I think it's 12 weeks, then it can't actually be described as compostable. It's actually a real challenge for the shelter and guard manufacturers to address that, because they want to make a product that is going to be biodegradable in the environment and in a harmless way. So compostable, but also it needs to last a good few years to actually do the job it's supposed to do. So it is a genuine challenge for them. There are non-plastic materials, as I've already mentioned, so papers and cards, sometimes coated with waterproof materials. They can be made of recycled materials. They might not last as long as some plastics. You may need to replace them, but that might be fine for you. You might factor that in to your project. And then all plastics are not the same. There are fossil-based plastics we're all familiar with, but they can be readily reused and recycled relatively easily. And there are plastics that have a component of them made of recycled plastic, and then there are bioplastic. Now, I'm sure you know this, but bioplastic is not short for biodegradable plastic. It refers to the biopolymer that it's made of originally, like so the molecule that's originally made of, like wool or cotton or cellulose or oil from a biological source. Thanks, Ian. So that all got a little bit technical towards the end. Apologies for that, but there's actually a really easy step-by-step guide to help you make your decisions as to how you're going to protect your young trees. You can find it on our website. This is the name of it. You can just Google that. And yeah, please do. I invite you to have a look at that and help you make your choices. Thank you. Oh yes, and the Tree Growers Guide, of course. This is a brilliant new resource, actually, been produced by our partners, so the Tree Council and More Trees and Cornwall County Council and Norfolk County Council. It's a guide with species, tree species. It tells you how to grow things from seed. It tells you how to start or work with a community tree nursery that Ian was mentioning earlier on. And it's a really great read. I can heartily recommend it. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you both. That was great, Jackie and Ian. We've got loads of questions coming in thick and fast, so we'll try and get through as many of these as we can in the time that we've got left. So Jackie, I think you see the questions. I think maybe there's a few probably that are quite quick ones to just knock through first. Is mulching with wool suitable? Ian, I think you mentioned mulching.
That is something that depends on how it's treated, I think. I've not tried it personally, so I don't think I can recommend it, and I think it's probably something that we need to try, but it has an interesting implication of not being, it's sort of an animal product. But at the same time, you know, if as a waste product, then why not? It could be a useful thing for us to take a look at and see whether there may be some potential in it. But I don't know that the level or the speed at which it can break down, and you know, it may need treatment and it might need processing. So it's something that we'd need to think about and something that needs testing. Okay, thank you. I don't know if can people see us now, or we still got the slides on? Maybe we've just taken that. There we go. So everybody can see our lovely smiley faces. So we've got lots of questions. Gosh, those are great questions here, actually. Somebody's mentioned about when they've seen gappy hedges being pulled up and replanted with whips. There's a question about landowners. I'll come back to that in a second. But the question is, do remaining hedge plants need to be coppiced to prevent shading when you are gapping up with new whips? Don't know. I mean, I think that's usually the case, isn't it? That they do need, it's best when you coppice them first. I mean, it's just sort of reducing the competition, really, isn't it? You're stopping if you have trees there already, obviously shade is going to be an issue. both, and providing a bit of a rain shadow as well. So anything you can do to reduce that without damaging what's important already around those trees. That is the key. It's just balancing act, really.
Yeah. The same person asked about what can we do to persuade landowners to leave the remnants where there are old hedge remnants in place and just gap up. And I suppose that's really the kind, just awareness raising generally around hedgerows and their management and their value. And
I think it's really important to note that actually, traditional management does involve a lot of coppicing, and it's something that can lead to a much better hedge. In fact, in most cases, lead to a better hedge. In fact, when we talk about coppicing, it's probably worth noting that we could, and it's advisable to, coppice a new hedge potentially at 3 years, and that will create a hedge which is much thicker and better for stock control and for wildlife. If you can do it at 3 years, because I think in Silver, the book that is the reference point in the sort of 1700s, that he mentions that actually if you coppice it at 3 years, then you'll get a 7-year-old hedge the year after, because it grows back so quickly. So it's the regrowth you're looking for. It's nice and thick, and it's going to be thorny, because the hawthorn within that hedge will respond defensively and create a really nice thick hedge. So if we can look at old hedges and be less sensitive to cutting, I think that would be quite useful. So that's the traditional way anyway.
There's a few questions about managing hedgerows, managing newly planted hedgerows, and things like that. And just to say, a lot of these, because we won't have time for all the questions we've got here tonight, but we've got another one of these talks on Wednesday specifically about managing hedgerows. So if any of you could join us on Wednesday, there'll be loads more detailed info about actually managing hedgerows once they're in existence. So just in case we don't get through all.
And if you want any more answers about how to plant trees, John Stokes and the Tree Council have done a video which we'll be providing the link. It's a YouTube video which takes you through all of the things that I've mentioned, really, in terms of the practicalities. So feel free to get that from, I think, the chat. Are you going to put it in the chat?
Yeah, we'll share it in. Another quick mulch question as we're focusing on planting tonight. Someone said that they've heard that fresh wood chip isn't a good idea because it can be too acidic. Did you cover that, Ian? Does that matter? It
can be. No, I mean, that's quite. I didn't know whether to cover that or not, but because it's quite
too techie.
But I think it is important to note that the acidity probably comes from the type or the species that have been chips, and because the majority of chip from arborists in the past has been conifers that have been removed, old hedges or overgrown leylandii. So there is a risk of it, but it's not as much of a risk on certain soil types that might be limey already. So I shouldn't worry too much. And to be honest, you're only going to be suppressing that weed from coming through by having fresh on top. So look at the mix that you have from your tree surgeon / arborist. Just check that it doesn't have a majority of the conifer species in it, and then you'll know whether it's going to be acidic.
Okay, while we're on the acidic topic, just to check, I can't find it now, I think somebody asked about I think you mentioned about not planting in peat, and I think you meant about not actually buying peat in. If you've actually got peaty soil, and that's what
it's a deep organic soil. Deep organic soils includes peat, and actually peat is something you shouldn't be planting on because it dries it out and therefore release the carbon that's within it. They should remain wet. The likelihood of you doing that, or being somebody who has a peaty garden to the point where it's a problem, it's unlikely. It's just something that we're aware of when planting trees, particularly forests.
If it's peaty, it's best to Jackie, we've got a community tree nursery question around, if I can find it, I've lost it. Oh, here we go. Container grown trees versus bare root. Is one better than the other to minimize root loss, provided that the container grown trees are not allowed to become pot bound? Containers versus root, there's quite a lot of guidance on that in the new tree growers guide, isn't there, that we can point people to?
Well, that is right. There's lots of information there. As far as I'm aware, the main difference is that one's grown in soil, one's grown in the ground, and you dig it up and you plant it as bare root. That's fine. So I don't, yeah, just have a look in the Tree Growers Guide, really.
Yeah, there's pros and cons of both, aren't there, I think, in terms of costs.
It's always the way, isn't it? There's always pros and cons, and it's best to make your own individual choice, but informed.
Yeah, the Tree Growers Guide does have, it sort of goes through the both methods and pros and cons of both. The Tree Growers Guide that Jackie mentioned, the book is already available, and the rest of it's going to be, more of it's going to be going up actually this week during National Hedgerow Week. So if you click on tonight, it's not there, but it will be going up later this week because we're putting new things on through the week this week. So keep an eye out for it. Both, any particular species that you'd recommend to establish a good sized hedge quickly? Anything in addition to what you've mentioned already? In terms of some quicker growing species?
There's I think if you're looking at quick growing species, I think probably the hawthorn and blackthorn is the best way to go, because it's a good backbone for any hedge, and then add in your particular mix that you need given the priorities that you have and the soil type you do have. So there's plenty of guidance on what particular species you can plant, but as I said, if you can just look round what other species have been planted in hedgerows nearby to you, then that's a good reference point.
One of the other names for hawthorn is actually quickthorn, isn't it? For that very reason. So and yet loads, obviously we can only cover a small amount this evening, but on the HedgeLink website, which I think we've already put in the chat somewhere, there's loads and loads of information about planting hedgerows, managing hedgerows, lots of these things that we're talking about this evening. And there's even a sort of a hedge hub, which is a new sort of search function on there that you can look for guidance and advice about lots of different hedgerow related topics. So go on there and fill your boots with hedge information. Okay, what else have we got in here? Oh, somebody asked about, this is an interesting one, around legal requirements when you've got a hedgerow along a footpath. So if you particularly want to answer that, or I will answer that with my previous rights of way person hat on. So generally for that one, this person's got a hedgerow along a footpath and a row of willows on the other side. What's their legal requirements? I mean, basically, as if you're a landowner with a right of way on your land, it's around keeping the path passable and also safe for the public to use in a nutshell. So it needs to be not blocked by the willows or the hedgerow encroaching on it, and also it needs to stay safe in terms of boughs hanging over and that kind of thing. So
it's sort of high clearance, sort of like 2.2 to 2.5 meters, just so that somebody can go underneath.
So it's that kind of guidance really. Okay, what else have we got? I think might have mentioned in about 5 meters. Can you explain why it's a 5 meter hedge for livestock hedges and 4 meters for none? Did you mention that in your talk? Yeah.
I would say that was very rough. There's no definitives. To be frank, I would say that it's whatever you think is required to prevent your animals escaping, really. It's very much a pragmatic thing and very much down to local knowledge.
It depends on the type on the animals as well, doesn't it? Which is one of the reasons why we've got lots of traditionally different styles of hedge laying, because it's a different type of hedge if you've got sheep versus if you've got bullocks, in terms of the strength of the hedge and the style, which is one of the reasons why we've got all these lots of different styles of hedgerows. So
how it's laid, whether it's on the bank, things like that.
Lots of variation. Sea buckthorn. This person mentions they associate sea buckthorn with the coast. Does it grow mostly does it grow only by the coast? Does it have preferences, or does it grow in most soils if that's something that somebody particularly wants to plant?
I think it's I think it'll be more going towards coastal, but it has grown quite well in Western Burt, sea buckthorn. And that's on a green sand inland. In the Cotswolds, so I would say that it's fairly tolerant, and you put it anywhere, and it's high in vitamin C, the actual berry, so well worth growing for the forage.
Oh, it's good. Oh, here's a good one. So are evergreen trees or hedges better for carbon capture than deciduous? Do we know the answer to that one? Is that
gosh, I'd love to know the answer to that.
That could be a difficult one for us to answer. I think probably lots of
carbon capture is a bit of a hot potato, I think.
We might not be able to answer that one. The gist is hedgerows. Some hedgerows and trees are better than no hedgerows and trees. So that's.
I think if you think about the carbon capture side, it's probably worth noting that it's not just about what goes into the wood; it's all the activity around the hedge. So all those invertebrates and all the soil activity and the improvement in the soil and the, you know, the actual, you know, the whole sort of pyramid of activity that goes from predator to prey, all of that, the more that's happening, the more carbon that's captured within that. So it's almost a living system that captures it, not just the wood. So
and that, like I say, underneath as well, it's as much as what's going on below as what you can see above ground.
Very important, that.
Okay, I'm just having one last quick skim because we're pretty much out of time. I'll have a quick look in the chat. Can you see anything, any juicy questions that we've missed in the chat? Oh, there's quite a lot of some of these we could pick, the ones we haven't had time, we could try and pick some of these up on the management, the hedgerow management one on Wednesday, if any of you can join us, because I think we're pretty much out of time now. Yeah, okay, brilliant. So I just must say thank you again to everybody for joining us. In particular, I know we've got a lot of our tree wardens on tonight and some of our members. I should have actually said at the beginning, which was remiss of me, that any of you who've not actually come across the Tree Council before, who we are, we're a national environmental charity, and we bring together lots of different people all working together for the love of trees and hedgerows. So if you haven't come across us before and this is your first encounter, do have a look at our website. We've got loads of brilliant activities going on, grants available for planting hedgerows and trees, and packages at plants available for schools, loads of great guidance and advice around looking after and nurturing trees and hedgerows. And I will also just mention our funder. Our current hedgerow programme is being funded by a programme through DEFRA called the Trees Call to Action Fund, and we're going to be doing a whole load of different activities around hedgerows and raising awareness of them and better management of them and planting them with a number of other partners in the sector over the next few years. So we'll keep in touch with us, sign up for our newsletter if you want to get more hedge information, and join us for more hedge talks later this week. This is the first of several, and most of them are going to be recorded, so you can share them with other people or join in later if you can't make them live on the evening. But thank you, everybody. Thanks a lot for joining us, and thank you especially to Ian and Jackie. They were really great presentations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.